Good evening. Tonight's story is the ancient Chinese fable of Miss Chiao-No by Songling Pu. Although it's a bit weird and rambling, this story is surprisingly wholesome, with a calm, dreamy mood. Songling Pu collected the stories and fables for Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio in the 17th century, but this version was translated and published by Herbert Allen Giles in 1918. Giles provides copious footnotes with context and additional information. These footnotes are pretty long and not necessary for the enjoyment of the story as a work of fiction. I will put the text on the screen, and you can read them if you wish. And now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Kung Su Li was a descendant of Confucius. He was a man of considerable ability and an excellent poet. A fellow student to whom he was much attached became magistrate at Tiantai and sent for Kung to join him. Unfortunately, just before Kung arrived, his friend died, and he found himself without the means of returning home, so he took up his abode in a Buddhist monastery where he was employed in transcribing for the priests. Several hundred paces to the west of this monastery, there was a house belonging to a Mr. Shan, a gentleman who had known better days, but who had spent all his money in a heavy lawsuit, and then, as his family was a small one, had gone away to live in the country and left his house vacant. One day there was a heavy fall of snow which kept visitors away from the monastery, and Kung, finding it dull, went out. As he was passing by the door of the house above mentioned, a young man of very elegant appearance came forth, who, the moment he saw Kung, ran up to him and, with a bow, entered into conversation, asking him to be pleased to walk in. Kung was much taken with the young man and followed him inside. The rooms were not particularly large, but adorned throughout with embroidered curtains, and from the walls hung scrolls and drawings by celebrated masters. On the table lay a book, the title of which was Jottings from Paradise, and turning over its leaves, Kung found therein many strange things. He did not ask the young man his name, presuming that, as he lived in the Shan family mansion, he was necessarily the owner of the place. The young man, however, inquired what he was doing in that part of the country and expressed great sympathy with his misfortunes, recommending him to set about taking pupils. "Alas," said Kung, "who will play Maecenas to a distressed wayfarer like myself?" "If," replied the young man, "you would condescend so far, I, for my part, would gladly seek instruction at your hands." Kung was much gratified at this, but said he dared not arrogate to himself the position of teacher, and begged merely to be considered as the young man's friend. He then asked him why the house had been shut up for so long, to which the young man replied, "This is the Shan family mansion. It has been closed all this time because of the owner's removal into the country. My surname is Huang Fu, and my home is in Shenxi. But, as our house has been burned down in a great fire, we have put up here for a while." Thus Mr. Kung found out that his name was not Shan. That evening they spent in laughing and talking together, and Kung remained there for the night. In the morning a lad came in to light the fire, and the young man, rising first, went into the private part of the house. Mr. Kung was sitting up with the bedclothes still huddled round him when the lad looked in and said, "Master is coming." So he jumped up with a start, and in came an old man with a silvery beard, who began to thank him, saying, "I am very much obliged to you for your condescension in becoming my son's tutor. At present he writes in a villainous hand, and I can only hope you will not allow the ties of friendship to interfere with discipline." Thereupon he presented Mr. Kung with an embroidered suit of clothes, a sable hat, and a set of shoes and stockings, and, when the latter had washed and dressed himself, he called for wine and food. Kung could not make out what the valances of the chairs and tables were made of, they were so very bright-colored and dazzling. By and by, when the wine had circulated several times, the old gentleman picked up his walking stick and took his leave. After breakfast, the young man handed in his theme, which turned out to be written in an archaic style and not at all after the modern fashion of essay writing. Kung asked him why he had done this, to which the young man replied that he did not contemplate competing at the public examinations. In the evening they had another drinking bout, but it was agreed that there should be no more of it after that night. The young man then called the boy and told him to see if his father was asleep or not, adding that, if he was, he might quietly summon Miss Perfume. The boy went off, first taking a guitar out of a very pretty case, and, in a few minutes, in came a very nice-looking young girl. The young man bade her play The Death of Shun, and, seizing an ivory plectrum, she swept the chords, pouring forth a vocal melody of exquisite sweetness and pathos. He then gave her a goblet of wine to drink, and it was midnight before they parted. Next morning they got up early and settled down to work. The young man proved an apt scholar. He could remember what he had once read, and at the end of 2 or 3 months had made astonishing progress. Then they agreed that every 5 days they would indulge in a symposium, and that Miss Perfume should always be of the party. One night, when the wine had gone to Kung's head, he seemed to be lost in reverie, whereupon his young friend, who knew what was the matter with him, said, "This girl was brought up by my father. I know you find it lonely, and I have long been looking out for a nice wife for you." "Let her only resemble Miss Perfume," said Kung, "and she will do." "Your experience," said the young man, laughing, "is but limited, and consequently anything is a surprise to you. If Miss Perfume is your beau ideal, it will not be difficult to satisfy you." Some 6 months had passed away when one day Mr. Kung took it into his head that he would like to go out for a stroll in the country. The entrance, however, was carefully closed, and on asking the reason, the young man told him that his father wished to receive no guests for fear of causing interruption to his studies. So Kung thought no more about it, and by, when the heat of summer came on, they moved their study to a pavilion in the garden. At this time, Mr. Kung had a swelling on the chest about as big as a peach, which, in a single night, increased to the size of a bowl. There he lay, groaning with the pain, while his pupil waited upon him day and night. He slept badly and took hardly any food, and in a few days the place got so much worse that he could neither eat nor drink. The old gentleman also came in, and he and his son lamented over him together. Then the young man said, "I was thinking last night that my sister, Chiao-No, would be able to cure Mr. Kung, and accordingly I sent over to my grandmother's asking her to come. She ought to be here by now." At that moment a servant entered and announced Miss Chiao-No, who had come with her cousin, having been at her aunt's house. Her father and brother ran out to meet her, and then brought her in to see Mr. Kung. She was between 13 and 14 years old, and had beautiful eyes with a very intelligent expression in them, and a most graceful figure besides. No sooner had Mr. Kung beheld this lovely creature than he quite forgot to groan, and began to brighten up. Meanwhile the young man was saying, "This respected friend of mine is the same to me as a brother. Try, sister, to cure him." Miss Chiao-No immediately dismissed her blushes and, rolling up her long sleeves, approached the bed to feel his pulse. As she was grasping his wrist, Kyung became conscious of a perfume more delicate than that of the epidendrum, and then she laughed, saying, "This illness was to be expected, for the heart is touched. Though it is severe, a cure can be effected, but, as there is already a swelling, not without using the knife." Then she drew from her arm a gold bracelet, which she pressed down upon the suffering spot until, by degrees, the swelling rose within the bracelet and overtopped it by an inch and more, the outlying parts that were inflamed also passing under, and thus very considerably reducing the extent of the tumor. With one hand she opened her robe and took out a knife with an edge as keen as paper, and pressing the bracelet down all the time with the other, proceeded to cut lightly round near the root of the swelling. The dark blood gushed forth and stained the bed and the mat, but Mr. Kung was delighted to be near such a beauty, not only felt no pain, but would willingly have continued the operation, that she might sit by him a little longer. In a few moments the whole thing was removed and looked like a growth which had been cut off of a tree. Here Miss Chiao-No called for water to wash the wound, and from between her lips she took a red pill as big as a bullet, which she laid upon the flesh, and, after drawing the skin together, passed round and round the place. The first turn felt like the searing of a hot iron, the second like a gentle itching, and at the third he experienced a sensation of lightness and coolness which penetrated into his very bones and marrow. The young lady then returned the pill to her mouth and said, "He is cured," hurrying away as fast as she could. Mr. Kung jumped up to thank her and found that his complaint had quite disappeared. Her beauty, however, had made such an impression on him that his troubles were hardly at an end. From this moment he gave up his books and took no interest in anything. This state of things was soon noticed by the young man, who said to him, "My brother, I have found a fine match for you." "Who is it to be?" asked Kung. "Oh, one of the family," replied his friend. Thereupon Mr. Kung remained some time lost in thought, and at length said, "Please don't." Then, turning his face to the wall, he repeated these lines: "Speak not of lakes and streams to him who has once seen the sea. The clouds that circle Wu's peak are the only clouds for me." The young man guessed to whom he was alluding and replied, "My father has a very high opinion of your talents, and would gladly receive you into the family, but that he has only one daughter, and she is much too young. My cousin, Ah Sung, however, is 17 years old, and not at all a bad-looking girl. If you doubt my word, you can wait in the veranda until she takes her daily walk in the garden, and thus judge for yourself." This Mr. Kung acceded to, and accordingly saw Miss Chiao-No come out with a lovely girl, her black eyebrows beautifully arched, and her tiny feet encased in phoenix-shaped shoes, as like one another as they well could be. He was, of course, delighted, and begged the young man to arrange all preliminaries, and the very next day his friend came to tell him that the affair was finally settled. A portion of the house was given up to the bride and bridegroom, and the marriage was celebrated with plenty of music and hosts of guests, more like a fairy wedding than anything else. Mr. Kung was very happy and began to think that the position of paradise had been wrongly laid down, until one day the young man came to him and said, "For the trouble you have been at in teaching me, I shall ever remain your debtor. At the present moment, the Shan family lawsuit has been brought to a termination, and they wish to resume possession of their house immediately. We, therefore, propose returning to Shenxi, and, as it is unlikely that you and I will ever meet again, I feel very sorrowful at the prospect of parting." Mr. Kung replied that he would go too, but the young man advised him to return to his old home. This, he observed, was no easy matter, upon which the young man said, "Don't let that trouble you. I will see you safe there." By and by his father came in with Mr. Kung's wife and presented Mr. Kung with 100 ounces of gold. And then the young man gave the husband and wife each one of his hands to grasp, bidding them shut their eyes. The next instant they were floating away in the air with the wind whizzing in their ears. In a little while he said, "You have arrived." And, opening his eyes, Kung beheld his former home. Then he knew that the young man was not a human being. Joyfully he knocked at the old door, and his mother was astonished to see him arrive with such a nice wife. They were all rejoicing together when he turned round and found that his friend had disappeared. His wife attended on her mother-in-law with great devotion and acquired a reputation both for virtue and beauty, which was spread round far and near. Some time passed away, and then Mr. Kung took his doctor's degree and was appointed governor of the jail in Yanyan. He proceeded to his post with his wife only, the journey being too long for his mother, and by, a son was born. Then he got into trouble by being too honest and official and threw up his appointment, but had not the wherewithal to get home again. One day when out hunting, he met a handsome young man riding on a nice horse, and seeing he was staring very hard, looked closely at him. It was young Huang Fu. So they drew bridle and fell to laughing and crying by turns, the young man then inviting Kung to go along with him. They rode on together until they had reached a village thickly shaded with trees so that the sun and sky were invisible overhead, and entered into a most elaborately decorated mansion such as might belong to an old established family. Kung asked after Miss Chiao-No and heard that she was married, and also that his own mother-in-law was dead, at which tidings he was greatly moved. Next day he went back and returned again with his wife. Chiao-No also joined them, and, taking up Kung's child, played with it, saying, "Your mother played us truant." Mr. Kung did not forget to thank her for her former kindness to him, to which she replied, "You're a great man now. Though the wound has healed, have you forgotten the pain yet?" Her husband, too, came to pay his respects, returning with her on the following morning. One day the young Huang Fu seemed troubled in spirit and said to Mr. Kung, "A great calamity is impending. Can you help us?" Mr. Kung did not know what he was alluding to, but readily promised his assistance. The young man then ran out and summoned the whole family to worship in the ancestral hall, at which Mr. Kung was alarmed and asked what it all meant. "You know," answered the young man, "I am not a man, but a fox. Today we shall be attacked by thunder, and if only you will aid us in our trouble, we may still hope to escape. If you are unwilling, take your child and go, that you may not be involved with us." Mr. Kung protested that he would live or die with them, and so the young man placed him with a sword at the door, bidding him remain quiet there in spite of all the thunder. He did as he was told, and soon saw black clouds obscuring the light until it was all as dark as pitch. Looking round, he could see that the house had disappeared, and that its place was occupied by a huge mound and a bottomless pit. In the midst of his terror, a fearful peal was heard, which shook the very hills, accompanied by a violent wind and driving rain. Old trees were torn up, and Mr. Kung became both dazed and deaf. Yet he stood firm until he saw in a dense black column of smoke a horrid thing with a sharp beak and long claws, with which it snatched someone from the hole and was disappearing up with the smoke. In an instant, Kung knew by her clothes and shoes that the victim was no other than Chiao-No, and instantly jumping up, he struck the devil violently with his sword and cut it down. Immediately the mountains were riven, and a sharp peal of thunder laid Kung dead upon the ground. Then the clouds cleared away, and Chiao-No gradually came round to find Kung dead at her feet. She burst out crying at the sight and declared that she would not live since Kung had died for her. Kung's wife also came out, and they bore the body inside. Chiao-No then made Ah Sung hold her husband's head, while her brother prized open his teeth with a hairpin, and she herself arranged his jaw. She next put a red pill into his mouth and, bending down, breathed into him. The pill went along with the current of air, and presently there was a gurgle in his throat, and he came round. Seeing all the family about him, he was disturbed as if waking from a dream. However, they were all united together, and fear gave place to joy. But Mr. Kung objected to live in that out-of-the-way place, and proposed that they should return with him to his native village. To this they were only too pleased to assent, all except Chiao-No, and while Mr. Kung invited her husband, Mr. Wu, as well, she said she feared her father and mother-in-law would not like to lose the children. They had tried all day to persuade her, but without success, when suddenly in rushed one of the Wu family's servants, dripping with perspiration and quite out of breath. They asked what was the matter, and the servant replied that the Wu family had been visited by a calamity on the very same day and had every one perished. Chiao-No cried very bitterly at this and could not be comforted, but now there was nothing to prevent them from all returning together. Mr. Kung went into the city for a few days on business, and then they set to work packing up night and day. On arriving at their destination, separate apartments were allotted to young Mr. Huang Fu, and these he kept carefully shut up, only opening the door to Mr. Kung and his wife. Mr. Kung amused himself with the young man and his sister, Chiao-No, filling up the time with chess, wine, conversation, and good cheer, as if they had been one family. His little boy, Juan, grew up to be a handsome young man, but with a touch of the fox in his composition, so that when he showed himself abroad, he was immediately recognized as the son of a fox. The best sentence in this story is actually 2 sentences. The entrance, however, was carefully closed, and on asking the reason, the young man told him that his father wished to receive no guests for fear of causing interruption to his studies. So Kung thought no more about it, and by, when the heat of summer came on, they moved their study to a pavilion in the garden. I chose those sentences because they're one of the first times that this story seems about to take this dark turn and that events are now really going to start happening and coming together, but then they just don't. This story is full of moments where it seems like a crucial character or a plot device or something has just been introduced, and then instead of everything taking off, everything just returns to normal and rambles on. I love the idea that this man can go out for a walk one day, start up a conversation with a stranger, get invited into their house, and then simply never, ever leave. And it is a real, true, solid, wholesome friendship. They do become like brothers. And then Kung says that he is willing to die to defend the family, and then he does die to defend the family. But then, of course, he's brought back to life, and the ordinary business of packing and moving just starts right up again. Although this story is named after Chiao-No, it's not really about her. I mean, she's got the red pill and the magic powers and everything, and she steps in at all of these crucial moments, but it's really not her story, and I think it's odd that it's named after her. Also, I was so relieved when they said she was too young to get married. It's just another way in which this story kind of introduces tension just to immediately dissipate it. So this story got me curious about Li Gong, the Chinese god of thunder. He started life as a mortal, but then blah, 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 he ate a magical fruit and he became a god. He carries a drum and a mallet that produce the sound of thunder, and a chisel to kill evildoers with. Wikipedia specifically says that it's a chisel, and he does have one in this Ming Dynasty scroll, so I guess it's a chisel. The Jade Emperor instructed Li Gong to kill bad people and evildoers with this chisel. But when he actually shows up with all of his companions, all the masters of the rain and the winds and everything, it gets really dark, and sometimes he kills the wrong people by mistake. So one day there's this girl, she was a rice farmer, and she dumped some rice into a river to soften it up for her old mother to eat. Li Gong thought she was wasting food, and he became enraged and he killed her. So the Jade Emperor got mad at him and revived the girl and made her into a goddess, and then made Li Gong marry her since he was responsible for her death, and now he would be responsible for her in the afterlife. So now this girl is his wife, Dian Mu, and she uses mirrors to shine light to make sure that Li Gong doesn't strike the wrong people, which is why lightning comes before thunder. Although he's depicted as basically a friendly monster god thing, most people never really worship Li Gong. However, he does have a few temples, and charms in his honor are actually quite common. People basically hope that they can summon him to defeat their enemies, although sometimes people just appeal to him for protection from evil. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. This week's confession is that lunch today was tofu and peas and noodles in a very spicy cream sauce with half an ajuma pepper and some cayenne, and it was delicious, and I loved it, and I have no regrets, except that the whole time I've been recording, my stomach has been making these very unusual sounds. So I've been mildly distracted the whole time trying to figure out how I'm going to get rid of them. Am I just going to edit them out? Can I filter them out? Maybe a noise gate? No lie, I actually considered trying to blend them in with some thunder sound effects at the end. I am curious to find out what I will actually do in post-production, and you'll have to let me know if you hear any questionable gurgling. Speaking of questionable gurgling, this is Restored Lore, where I search old, obscure, overlooked literature and try to connect it with new audiences. If you like strange and unusual stories from around the world, subscribe to the channel and choose notifications so you never miss a story. Please also like this video and click all the things that YouTube likes to boost the visibility of the channel and help us continue to grow. Thank you so much for all your support. Have a great evening, and I will see you next week.